At Blackridge Manor, where old money meets even older secrets, young maid Selene Morgan struggles to support her ailing mother while keeping her distance from the wealthy. But when Matthew Blackridge, the handsome heir to the estate, discovers her humming a haunting melody while cleaning, an unexpected connection forms that challenges their different worlds. As their forbidden romance blossoms through secret notes and midnight meetings, Matthew's controlling young father will stop at nothing to keep them apart. But before we start this story, comment below from where you are watching us. The summer heat beat down on Blackridge Manor like it had a grudge against the place. The grand old house sat on 20 acres of prime land, with its white columns and sprawling gardens that had seen better days. Inside those walls, old money and even older secrets lived together in an uneasy alliance. Selene Morgan wiped the sweat from her forehead as she lugged her cleaning supplies up the long driveway. At 24, she'd already learned that life rarely gave handouts, especially to girls like her who came from the wrong side of town. Her simple blue dress hung loosely on her slender frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. "Don't be late again," Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, had warned her yesterday. "The Blackridges may pay well, but they expect perfect tion." Selene couldn't afford to lose this job, not with her mother's medical bills piling up and the rent on their tiny apartment already 2 weeks overdue. She quickened her pace, her worn shoes crunching on the gravel. The back entrance to the manor stood open, and Selene slipped inside, the cool air a blessed relief from the scorching heat. The kitchen was empty except for Mrs. Winters, who stood with her arms crossed looking at her watch. "You're cutting it close, girl," the older woman said, her lips pinched tight. "Today, you're to clean the drawing room. Top to bottom, mind you. The family is away in Charleston, but they'll be back next week and everything must be perfect." "Yes, ma'am," Selene replied, keeping her eyes down. She'd learned that looking too directly at Mrs. Winters only invited more criticism. "And remember, you're to be invisible, clean and go, no wandering, no touching anything you shouldn't, and absolutely no helping yourself to anything in the pantry." Mrs. Winters narrowed her eyes. The last girl got too comfortable and found herself without a job. Selene nodded, clutching her pail tighter. "I understand. See that you do. The drawing room is through the main hall, first door on the right. I'll check your work before you leave." With that, Mrs. Winters turned and marched away, her keys jangling at her waist like a jailer's. Selene made her way through the grand hallway, her steps quiet on the polished floor. Blackridge Manor was like something from another world, a world where people didn't count pennies or worry about keeping the lights on. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched her pass with judgmental eyes. The drawing room was the grandest space she'd ever seen. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating fern iture covered in white sheets like ghosts at rest. Dust motes danced in the beams of light. The room hadn't been used in weeks, maybe months. Selene set down her supplies and began to work, pulling the sheets off the furniture one by one. A grand piano emerged from beneath one cover, its black surface gleaming even through a thin layer of dust. Elegant sofas and armchairs appeared, their rich fabric the color of burgundy wine. As she worked, Selene hummed softly to herself, an old song her mother used to sing when times were better. The familiar tune kept her company as she dusted shelves lined with leather-bound books she couldn't read and cleaned crystal figurines worth more than she made in a month. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing the marble floor when she heard it, the sound of the front door opening and closing. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Selene froze. Mrs. Winters had said the family was away. Perhaps it was another staff member. But the footsteps sounded too confident, too entitled to belong to a servant. Before she could decide whether to announce her presence or try to slip away unnoticed, the drawing room door swung open. A tall man stood in the doorway. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and his blue eyes widened at the sight of her. He wore an expensive suit that fit him perfectly, though his tie was loosened at the neck. Selene scrambled to her feet, nearly knocking over the bucket of soapy water beside her. I'm sorry, sir. I was told the family was away." The man stared at her for a long moment, something flickering in his gaze that Selene couldn't quite read. "I came back early," he finally said, his voice rich and deep. Business in Charleston concluded faster than expected. He stepped into the room and Selina took an instinctive, first step back. She knew who he was, Matthew Blackridge, the only son and heir to the Blackridge fortune. She'd seen his picture in the local paper, usually attending some charity event or business function. "You're new," he said, looking at her with interest. "I don't believe we've met." "No, sir," Celine replied, keeping her eyes downcast. "I started 2 weeks ago. I'm just here to clean." Matthew moved closer, and Celine could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. "And what's your name?" "Celine Morgan." He was quiet for so long that she risked glancing up. He was watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Where have you been all my life?" he asked softly, the words so unexpected that Celine wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. I was just finishing, sir," she stammered, reaching for her rag on the floor. "I'll be out of your way in a moment." Matthew stepped closer, his shoes polished to a mirror shine against the half-cleaned floor. "I've been in 100 rooms," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "and not one of them felt alive until now." Celine's heart pounded in her chest. This had to be some kind of joke, or worse, the kind of attention that got maids fired, or worse. Mrs. Winters had warned her about rich men and their wandering eyes. "I should finish my work," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, Matthew replied, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he walked to the piano and ran his fingers lightly over the keys. "That song you were humming, what was it?" Celine blinked in surprise. "Just an old folk song my mother taught me. Nothing special." It sounded beautiful. He pressed a key, a single clear note hanging in the air between them. "Would you hum it again?" "Sir, I really shouldn't." "Please," he said, and there was something in his voice, not a command, but almost like a wish. Against her better judgment, Selene began to hum the melody again, softly at first, then with more confidence as Matthew began to pick out the notes on the piano, following her lead with surprising skill. "That's lovely," he said when she finished. "Do you know you shine when you think no one is looking?" The words caught her off guard, and Celine felt heat rising to her cheeks again. No one had ever spoken to her this way, certainly not someone like Matthew Blackridge. "I should go," she said, gathering her cleaning supplies quickly. "Mrs. Winters will be expecting me." Matthew didn't try to stop her, but as she reached the door, he called out, "Celine!" She turned, her hand on the doorknob. "I hope I'll see you again," he said simply. Celine didn't know how to respond to that, so she merely nodded and slipped out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like it wanted to escape. Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Winters was waiting with a scowl on her face. "You took your time," she said sharply, "and I've just heard that Mr. Matthew has returned early. Did you see him?" "Yes, ma'am," Celine admitted, knowing lies never ended well in a house like this. "He came into the drawing room while I was cleaning." Mrs. Winters's face tightened. "And? What happened?" "Nothing, ma'am. He just introduced himself, and I continued with my work." The lie came easily, protecting something Celine didn't quite understand yet. The housekeeper studied her face for a long moment. "See that it stays that way. The Blackridges don't mix with the help, and girls who forget that don't last long here." "Yes, ma'am," Celine said, keeping her expression neutral despite the warning bells ringing in her head. "You'll come back tomorrow to finish the upstairs rooms. Don't be late." As Celine walked Dee home that evening, the summer heat still heavy in the air, she couldn't stop thinking about Matthew Blackridge and the strange conversation in the drawing room. It had felt like something from a dream, or from one of those romance novels her friend Tina was always reading. Men like Matthew Blackridge didn't notice girls like her, except as furniture, things that cleaned and served and then disappeared. That's how the world worked. She knew better than to read anything into his words. The small apartment she shared with her mother was stifling when she arrived. The air conditioning had broken again, and they couldn't afford to fix it. Her mother sat by the open window, her once beautiful face now gaunt from illness. "How was work today?" she asked, as Celine set her bag down. "Fine," Celine replied, not meeting her mother's eyes. "Just cleaning as usual." Later that night, As she lay in bed, the window open to catch any hint of a breeze, Selene found herself humming the same tune from earlier. The memory of Matthew's fingers on the piano keys, finding the notes she hummed, played over and over in her mind. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to herself in the darkness. Nothing happened. Nothing will happen. But when she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of blue eyes and a voice asking, "Where have you been all my life?" The next morning, Selene arrived at Blackridge Manor half an hour early, determined to prove her reliability to Mrs. Winters. The housekeeper seemed surprised but pleased by her punctuality. "Today, you'll clean the library and Mr. Matthew's study," she instructed. "He's asked not to be disturbed. He has important business calls all morning." Selene felt both relief and an inexplicable disappointment at this news. "Yes, ma'am." The library was a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bow oak shelves and leather chairs that invited long hours of reading. Selene worked methodically, dusting each shelf with care, occasionally pausing to run her fingers over the spines of books with gold-lettered titles she struggled to decipher. Her reading wasn't good, a fact she kept hidden from most people. School had never been easy for her, and having to drop out to work when her mother got sick hadn't helped. Books like these, hundreds of them, represented a world as inaccessible to her as the lifestyle of the Blackridges themselves. She was standing on a library ladder, reaching for a high shelf, when she heard the door open behind her. "Mrs. Winters said I'd find you here." Matthew's voice startled her and she nearly lost her balance. A strong hand steadied the ladder. "Careful," he said, looking up at her with concern. "That would be quite a fall." Selene clutched her duster tightly. "I thought you had business calls, sir." "I finished early." He didn't move away from the ladder, his hand still resting on it. "And please call me Matthew. Sir makes me feel like my father." She climbed down carefully, very aware of his closeness. He was dressed more casually today, in a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. "I can come back later if you need to use the library," she offered, stepping away from him. "Actually, I came looking for you," Matthew said, and the directness of his statement left her momentarily speechless. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. "I wanted to give you this." Selene hesitated before taking it. Unfolding the crisp white fabric, she found a single pressed violet inside, deep purple and perfectly preserved. Along with it was a note in elegant handwriting. "I don't know your story, but I want to." She looked up at him, confusion and caution warring with a flutter of something warm in her chest. "Mr. Blackridge." "Matthew," he corrected gently. "Matthew," she conceded. "I don't understand. Why would you give me this?" He moved to one of the library windows, looking out over the manicured gardens. "Do you believe in connections, Selene? Those rare moments when you meet someone and something just clicks?" Selene didn't answer. She couldn't. Such ideas belonged to a different world than hers. "When I walked into that room yesterday and saw you, heard you humming that song, it felt like finding something I didn't even know I was missing." He turned back to face her, his expression open and earnest. "I know how this must sound, the rich man's son talking nonsense to the maid. But I'm not playing games, Selene. I just want to know you." Every instinct told Selene to put the violet back in his hand, to maintain the barrier that existed between people like her and people like him. But something in his eyes, a sincerity, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his privileged position, made her hesitate. "People would talk," she said finally. "I would lose my job. I wouldn't let that happen. You can't control everything, even with your name and money." A shadow passed over his face. "I know that better than most." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "All I'm asking is a chance, Selene, to talk, to understand who you are beyond this." He gestured at her cleaning apron. Before she could respond, voices in the hallway announced the approach of others. Selene quickly tucked the napkin and its contents into her pocket. The library door opened, and an older man entered, tall and imposing, with silver at his temples and cold eyes that took in the scene with immediate disapproval. Behind him was Mrs. W. Winters, her expression alarmed. "Matthew," the man said, his voice clipped, "I didn't realize you were in here." "Father," Matthew replied, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, "I was just looking for a book." Harold Blackridge's gaze moved to Celine, assessing her with a quick glance that somehow made her feel both seen and invisible at the same time. "And who is this?" "One of the new maids, sir," Mrs. Winters answered quickly. "Celine Morgan. She was just cleaning the library." "I see." The older Blackridge's tone suggested he might indeed see more than was being said. "Well, don't let us interrupt your work, girl. Matthew, I need to speak with you about the Charleston deal." "Of course, Father." Matthew's voice had changed, becoming more formal, more distant. He gave Celine one last look, apologetic perhaps, before following his father from the room. Mrs. Winters remained behind, her lips pressed set into a thin line. "What was that about?" she demanded, once the men were out of earshot. "Nothing," Celine said, her hand instinctively covering the pocket where the violet was hidden. "He was just looking for a book, like he said." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. "Let me make something very clear, Celine. The Blackridges are not like us. They live in a different world. Matthew Blackridge has been engaged 3 times already, each time to a girl from a good family with the right connections. Each time he's broken it off for reasons no one understands. He's charming and he's troubled, and he's absolutely not for the likes of you." "I know my place, Mrs. Winters," Celine said quietly. "See that you remember it. Now finish in here, then move on to the study." After the housekeeper left, Selene leaned against a bookshelf, her heart racing. She pulled out the pressed violet again, looking at the delicate pearl-peely petals and the carefully written note. She should throw it away. Forget this strange encounter and focus on what mattered, keeping her job, paying the bills, taking care of her mother. Instead, she carefully folded the napkin and tucked it back into her pocket. The next morning, before reporting to Blackridge Manor, Celine stopped by a small patch of wild grass near her apartment building. Violets grew there, tiny spots of color in the urban landscape. She picked one, its stem still moist with dew, and pressed it between 2 pages of the small notebook she carried. Later, while cleaning the kitchen at the manor, she placed the violet on the windowsill when no one was looking. It sat there, a small purple secret against the white paint. She didn't expect anything to come of it, just a small acknowledgement, a tiny rebellion against the rules that governed her life. But the following day, when she entered the drawing room to dust, she found a book placed carefully on the piano. Its leather cover was worn with age and use, unlike the pristine volumes in the library. There was no note, but when she opened it, she discovered it was a collection of folk songs, the very one she had been humming that first day. Celine glanced around nervously, then allowed herself to flip through the pages. The musical notations meant little to her, but the lyrics were printed underneath, and some of the songs were familiar, tunes her mother had sung during happier days. She closed the book quickly when she heard footsteps approaching, but no one entered. After a moment of hesitation, she slipped the book into her cleaning apron. She would return it tomorrow, she told herself. She just wanted to show her mother, to see if she recognized more of the songs. That night, as she showed the book to her mother, whose eyes lit up with recognition, Celine felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement. She was breaking rules, crossing lines that weren't meant to be crossed, yet something about Matthew Blackridge's interest made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. "Where did you get this?" her mother asked, running her fingers over the pages with reverence. "It's borrowed," Celine replied carefully, "from someone at work." Her mother gave her a knowing look but didn't press further. Instead, she began to sing one of the songs, her voice thin but still beautiful, filling their small apartment with memories of better days. Days passed, and a silent exchange developed between Celine and Matthew. Small gifts appeared for her, a bookmark with a pressed flower, a chocolate left on a windowsill, a note with a simple question. "What makes you smile?" She responded in kind when she dared, a perfect acorn she'd found on her walk to work, a sketch she'd drawn of the manor's gardens. They rarely spoke directly. Mrs. Winters kept a closer eye on Celine now, as if sensing something amiss, and Harold Blackridge seemed to be keeping his son busy with business matters. But occasionally, they would pass in a hallway, and Matthew would hold her gaze for a moment longer than propriety allowed, or their fingers would brush as she handed him a tea tray, sending electricity up her arm. It was nothing, Celine told herself. A rich man's passing fancy. A game to alleviate his boredom, but her heart refused to listen to her head. One afternoon, as she dusted the massive grandfather clock in the main hall, Matthew appeared at the top of the stairs. He glanced around quickly, then descended, his steps purposeful. "I need to speak with you," he said in a low voice when he reached her. "Tonight, after everyone's asleep." Alarm bells rang in Celine's mind. I don't work nights. Meet me in the garden by the old oak tree, midnight." His eyes were intense, almost urgent. "Please, Celine, it's important." Before she could respond, the sound of a door opening sent him stepping back, his expression returning to casual indifference as Mrs. Winters appeared from the dining room. "Ah, Mrs. Winters," he said smoothly. "I was just telling Celine that the clock seems to be running slow. Perhaps someone should look at it." "Of course, Mr. Matthew," the housekeeper replied, her suspicious gaze moving between them. "I'll have Mr. Finch check it tomorrow." As Matthew walked away, Celine felt the weight of Mrs. Winters' stare on her back. The invitation hung in the air like a dangerous promise. Meeting him alone at night would be crossing a line from which there might be no return. She knew she shouldn't go, knew it with absolute certainty. But as midnight approached, she found herself slipping out of her apartment, telling her sleeping mother she was just going for a walk to clear her head. The night was warm, stars speckling the sky above as Selina made her way through the Kew Wyatt streets toward Blackridge Manor. The main gates would be locked, but there was a loose section in the hedge along the east side of the property that she'd noticed during her walks home. Her heart pounded as she squeezed through the gap, her simple dress catching on branches. The grand house loomed in the distance, most of its windows dark except for a light in what she knew was Harold Blackridge's study. The old oak tree stood at the edge of the Fourmayell Gardens, its massive branches creating a canopy of shadows. As Celine approached, she saw a figure waiting beneath it. Matthew, his white shirt almost luminous in the moonlight. "You came," he said as she drew near, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "I shouldn't be here," Celine replied, keeping a careful distance between them. "If anyone finds out, no one will," he assured her. "My father is working late, and the staff is asleep." "What's so important that it couldn't wait until morning?" Matthew ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his nervousness. "My father is sending me to New York. There's a business merger he wants me to oversee." "Oh." Celine wasn't sure why this required a midnight meeting. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow, and I'll be gone for at least a month." He stepped closer, his eyes searching her face in the dappled moonlight. "I couldn't leave without seeing you, really seeing you, not just passing in hallways or leaving notes." Celine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the summer night. "I don't understand what this is, Matthew. What you want from me." "Nothing," he said quickly. "Everything. I don't know." He let out a frustrated breath. "From the moment I saw you in that drawing room, something changed. It's like I was sleepwalking through my life and suddenly I was awake." "You don't even know me," Celine said, though the words hurt to speak. "But I want to. That's the point." He reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she let him take it. His palm was warm against hers. "I know how it looks. The rich man's son and the maid, like some cliché from a bad novel. But what if it's more than that? What if it's real?" Celine looked down at their joined hands. "People like me don't get real with people like you, Matthew. We get used and discarded. We lose our jobs and our reputations. We become cautionary tales." "Is that what you think I'm doing, using you?" There was hurt in his voice and something else, anger perhaps. "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "This doesn't make sense. You could have anyone." "I don't want anyone." His voice was fierce now. "I want you. The girl who hums while she works, who leaves violets on windowsills and draws pictures of gardens, who looks at books she can't read with such longing it breaks my heart." Celine froze. "How did you—" I notice things, he said softly. I notice you. He reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. Come with me to New York. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and wild. What? Selene stepped back, breaking contact. Have you lost your mind? Probably, he admitted with a rueful smile. But I mean it. Come with me. Not as my maid or my anything improper. Just come. See a different world. Give this us a chance to be something real. Selene stared at him, her mind racing. You're asking me to leave my home, my mother, everything, to follow a man I barely know to New York? Based on what? A few notes and pressed flowers? Based on this, Matthew said, and before she could react, he leaned forward and kissed her. His lips were soft against hers, and he kissed gentle but insistent. For a moment, Selene forgot everything, who she was, who he was, all the reasons this was wrong. She kissed him back, her hands finding his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the fine fabric of his shirt. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, reality came crashing back. I can't, she whispered. I have responsibilities. My mother is sick. I need this job. Matthew nodded, though disappointment shadowed his features. I understand, but the offer stands, and I'll be back in a month. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. This is for you. Don't open it until tomorrow. Selene took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. I should go. Let me walk you home. No, she said firmly. This is already too risky. He caught her hand as she turned to leave. Selene, what I feel for you, it's not going to disappear when I go to New York. Kay, I need you to know that. She looked into his eyes, searching for deception, but finding only earnest intensity. Good night, Matthew, she said softly, then pulled her hand free and walked away, the envelope clutched tightly in her grasp. As she slipped back through the hedge and made her way home through the quiet streets, Selene's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of her, the practical, survival-focused part, knew that whatever was happening between her and Matthew Blackridge could only end in heartbreak. Men like him didn't end up with women like her, no matter what romantic notions they might entertain. But another part of her, a part she'd kept carefully guarded for years, whispered of possibilities, of chances, of the look in his eyes when he'd asked her to come with him. When she finally reached her apartment, she hid the envelope under her mattress, determined not to open it until morning as he'd asked. Sleep eluded her that night, her lips still tingling from the memory of his kiss, her mind replaying his words over and over. I don't want anyone, I want you. Morning came too quickly, the sun streaming through Selene's thin curtains. She reached under her mattress with tired hands and pulled out the envelope Matthew had given her. For a moment she just held it, wondering what promises or disappointments it might contain. Finally, she opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper and something else, a small brass key on a simple chain. She unfolded the note first. Selene, it read in Matthew's elegant handwriting, I understand why you can't come with me to New York, but I want you to know that I meant every word I said last night. This key opens the garden door at the east side of the manor. If you ever need anything while I'm gone, anything at all, use it. The garden house has a telephone you can use to reach me directly. My private number is written below. Please keep the key with you always. I'll be counting the days until I return. Matthew. Selene stared at the key in her palm. Such a small thing, yet it represented something huge. Trust, access, a connection between their worlds that shouldn't exist. She slipped the chain over her head, tucking the key beneath her dress where it rested cool against her skin. It was Rex. Claire's to keep it, she knew, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. At Blackridge Manor that day, there was a flurry of activity around Matthew's departure. Selene caught glimpses of him as she went about her cleaning duties, speaking with his father in the study, giving instructions to the chauffeur, checking his luggage in the main hall. Mrs. Winters kept Selene busy upstairs, far from the commotion. No need for you to be underfoot, she said, with a pointed look that made Selene wonder if the housekeeper suspected something. By the time Selene finished cleaning the guest bedrooms, She heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. From the window, she watched as Matthew placed his luggage in the trunk of the sleek black car. He paused before getting in, looking up at the house as if searching for something or someone. Celine stepped back from the window quickly, her heart pounding, but not quickly enough. For the briefest moment, their eyes met across the distance. Matthew gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before ducking into the car. Then he was gone, the car disappearing down the long driveway, taking with it all the impossible things he'd said to her under the oak tree. "Back to work, girl," Mrs. Winters said from the doorway, making Celine jump. "Those windows won't clean themselves." The days after Matthew's departure took on a strange, mu-Ted quality. Celine continued her duties at Blackridge Manor, moving through the grand rooms with a duster and mop, but everything felt hollow somehow. The house itself seemed to notice Matthew's absence. Rooms felt colder, shadows deeper. Harold Blackridge was rarely seen, locked away in his study with business associates who arrived in expensive cars and left with grim expressions. The few times Celine encountered him in the hallways, he barely acknowledged her existence, his cold eyes passing over her as if she were just another piece of furniture. A week after Matthew left, Celine was cleaning the drawing room when she noticed something on the piano, a small envelope with her name written on it. She glanced around nervously before opening it. Inside was a short note. "I miss your humming. New York is all noise and no music." She tucked the note into her pocket quickly, wondering how it had gotten there. Had Matthew arranged for someone to deliver it? Or had he sent it by mail to the house, not realizing how dangerous that might be? That evening, as she was leaving through the kitchen, Mrs. Winters stopped her. "There was a letter that came for you today," the housekeeper said, her tone suspicious. "Most irregular. Staff don't receive personal mail at the house." Celine's stomach dropped. "A letter?" "Yes, from New York." Mrs. Winters pulled an envelope from her pocket. "I've already spoken to Mr. Blackridge about it. He agrees it's inappropriate. May I have it, please?" Celine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Blackridge would like to speak with you first, in his study, now." The walk to Harold Blackridge's study felt like a march to the gallows. Celine had never been inside the room before. It was strictly off-limits to the household staff except for Mrs. Winters, who cleaned it personally. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came the clipped response from within. Harold Blackridge sat behind a massive desk, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression unreadable. The study was dark despite the early evening hour, with heavy curtains drawn across the windows and only a desk lamp providing illumination. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Celine said, her voice sounding small in the imposing room. Harold gestured to a chair a Crow SS from his desk. "Sit." Celine perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Winters tells me you've been receiving personal correspondence at this house," he said without preamble. "Care to explain?" "I don't know anything about it, sir," Celine replied, the lie bitter on her tongue. "I'm as surprised as you are." Harold leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "Are you? Because the letter is from New York, where, coincidentally, my son is currently staying." Celine said nothing, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm not a fool, Miss Morgan," Harold continued, his voice dangerously soft. "I've seen the way Matthew looks at you. He's always had a weakness for bad projects, people he thinks he can save." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out an envelope. Different from the one Mrs. Winters had shown her, this one had already been opened. "Do you know what this says?" he asked, removing a letter from inside. Celine shook her head mutely. "It's full of romantic nonsense, poetry, promises." His mouth twisted in disgust. "My son seems to think he's fallen in love with you." The words hit Celine like a physical blow. Love. Matthew had written that he loved her. "I didn't encourage him, sir," she managed to say, though her voice trembled. "Didn't you?" Harold's eyes were cold. "The violet on the windowsill, the book of folk songs that went missing from the library, the midnight meeting in the garden." Celine paled. He knew everything. "Oh yes, I know all about it," Harold confirmed, reading her expression. This house has been in my family for generations. Do you think anything happens here without my knowledge?" He stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to look out at the darkening grounds. Matthew has always been impulsive, emotional. He gets it from his mother. There was something like grief in his voice, quickly masked. But he is a Blackridge. He has responsibilities, a legacy to uphold. He turned back to face her. Whatever he thinks he feels for you is a passing fancy, a distraction, nothing more. "I understand, sir," Celine said quietly, fighting back tears. "I'll hand in my resignation." "That won't be necessary," Harold interrupted. "You're a good worker," Mrs. Winters says, "and finding reliable help these days is difficult." He returned to his desk, sitting down heavily. "No, you'll stay on, but there will be no more communication with my son, no more notes, no more meetings. Is that clear?" Celine nodded, relief mingling with heartbreak. She needed this job desperately, but the thought of never speaking to Matthew again cut deeper than she'd expected. "The letter Mrs. Winters intercepted will be returned to sender," Harold continued, "and if any others arrive, they'll meet the same fate. As for this," he held up the letter he'd already opened, "I think it's best if it disappears entirely." He struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. The flame caught quickly, consuming Matthew's words before Celine could even glimpse them. Harold dropped the burning letter into a metal wastebasket, watching dispassionately as it turned to ash. "You may go," he said, his attention already returning to the papers on his desk. Celine rose on shaky legs and headed for the door. "Miss Morgan," Harold called after her, making her pause with her hand on the doorknob. "Remember your place in this house. It will make things easier for everyone." Outside in the hallway, Celine leaned against the wall, fighting to regain her composure. Her fingers found the brass key hanging beneath her dress, its weight suddenly both a comfort and a burden. That night, sleep eluded her again. Matthew loved her, or at least he thought he did, enough to write it in a letter she would never read, now reduced to ashes in Harold Blackridge's wastebasket. She turned the key over and over in her fingers, remembering Matthew's words. "If you ever need anything while I'm gone, anything at all, use it." Did she need to hear his voice? To know if what his father said was true? Or would making that call only make things worse for both of them? Dawn was breaking when Selene finally made her decision. She would go to the garden house just once. She would call the number Matthew had given her. And then, depending on what he said, she would either put this foolishness behind her or she couldn't even let herself think of the alternative. Her mother was still asleep when Selene slipped out of the apartment. The streets were quiet in the early morning light as she made her way to Blackridge Manor, circling around to the east side where the garden wall stood. The small door was almost hidden by ivy, weathered wood blending into the surrounding stone. Celine's hands shook as she inserted the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the door swinging open with barely a creak. The garden beyond was beautiful in the morning light, a hidden paradise of roses, foxgloves, and neatly trimmed hedges. At the far end stood the garden house, a charming stone building that looked like something from a fairy tale. Selina hurried across the dewy grass, glancing nervously at the main house where curtains remained drawn. The garden house door was unlocked, and she slipped inside, finding herself in a cozy space with wicker furniture, potted plants, and shelves lined with gardening books. The telephone sat on a small table near the window. Celine stared at it for a long moment, her courage nearly failing her, but then she thought of the burning letter, of Harold Blackridge's dismissive words. A passing fancy, a distraction, nothing more. She had to know the truth. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number from Matthew's note. Each ring on the other end made her heart beat faster. What if he didn't answer? What if he did? "Hello?" Matthew's voice, warm and slightly rough, as if she'd woken him. Selene nearly hung up, panic surging through her. "Hello?" he repeated. "Who's calling?" "It's me," she finally managed. "Celine." There was a moment of stunned silence, then. "Celine? How? Are you using the garden house phone?" "Yes." "I'm sorry if it's too early." No, it's fine. I'm so glad to hear your voice." The genuine happiness in his tone made something twist in Celine's chest. "I've been thinking about you constantly. Did you get my letter?" She swallowed hard. No, your father intercepted it. Another silence, longer this time. I see, Matthew finally said, his voice tighter now. Did he speak to you? Yes. Celine glanced out the window, half expecting to see Harold Blackridge striding across the garden to catch her. He said, what you feel for me is just a passing fancy, that I'm a project to you, someone you think you can save. That's not true, Matthew said firmly. None of it. What I feel for you is real, Celine. More real than anything I've ever felt. You don't even know me, she whispered, echoing her words from their night in the garden. I know enough, he insisted. I know you're kind. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you love your mother and worry about her. I know you hum when you think no one's listening and that you look at books with such longing it breaks my heart. Tears pricked at Celine's eyes. Your father burned your letter before I could read it. Matthew's laugh was bitter. Of course he did. He's always tried to control my life, my choices. What did it say? Celine asked, needing to hear the words, even if they couldn't possibly be true. It said that I love you, Matthew replied simply. That I think I've been falling in love with you from the moment I saw you in that drawing room. That being away from you is like missing a part of myself I never knew I had. Celine closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Matthew, I meant every word, Celine, and I'll say them to your face when I come home. Your father won't allow it, she said. He made it very clear. No more notes, no more meetings. My father doesn't control me, Matthew said with determination. Not anymore. I'm coming home, Celine. Today. Now. What? No, you can't. Your business in New York can wait. This is more important. There was a rustling sound as if he was already getting dressed, preparing to leave. I need to see you to tell you these things in person. Please, Matthew, think about what you're doing, Celine pleaded. I could lose my job. You could... I don't care, he interrupted. For the first time in my life, I know what I want, who I want, and I'm not going to let my father or anyone else stand in the way. Before Celine could argue further, the garden house door swung open. She whirled around, the phone still clenched in her hand, to find Mrs. Winters standing in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. I thought I might find you here, the housekeeper said coldly. Mr. Blackridge will be very interested to hear about this. Celine, what's happening? Matthew's voice came thinly through the receiver. I have to go, she whispered, her eyes locked with Mrs. Winters. Please don't come home yet, it will only make things worse. She hung up before he could respond, her hand shaking. Mrs. Winters stepped further into the garden house, closing the door behind her. You foolish, foolish girl. Did you really think you could get away with this? That a man like Matthew Blackridge would actually care for someone like you? It's not what you think, Celine began, but the housekeeper cut her off with a harsh laugh. It's exactly what I think. You're not the first maid to catch the young master's eye, you know. Though I'll admit you've lasted longer than most. She shook her head in disgust. They all end the same way, dismissed without references, unable to find decent work, their reputations in tatters. Celine felt the blood drain from her face. There were others? Of course. Matthew has always had a soft spot for pretty girls with sad stories. Mrs. Winters' smile was cruel. His mother was the same. A shop girl his father fell for against his family's wishes. The marriage nearly ruined the Blackridge name. Harold won't let history repeat itself. The revelation hit Celine like a physical blow. Matthew's mother had been like her, a woman from the wrong side of the tracks. Was that why he'd been drawn to Celine? Was he simply trying to recreate his parents' story? I never meant for any of this to happen, Celine said quietly. And yet here we are. Mrs. Winters gestured to the door. Mr. Blackridge is waiting in his study. He wants to see you immediately. The walk back to the main house felt like a funeral procession. Celine's mind raced with desperate plans. She could run, she could beg for her job, she could deny everything. But what was the point? Harold Blackridge already knew the truth. The study was darker than before, the curtains fully drawn despite the morning sunlight outside. Harold sat in the same position as yesterday, his face like stone. Mrs. Winters tells me, "You were using the telephone in the garden house," he said without preamble, "making a call to New York, to my son." Celine didn't deny it. There was no point. "How did you gain access to the garden? That door is kept locked." Wordlessly, Celine pulled the chain from beneath her dress, the brass key glinting in the dim light. Harold's expression darkened. "I see. Matthew has been more reckless than I realized." He held out his hand. "The key, if you please, E." Celine hesitated only briefly before removing the chain and placing the key in his palm. It felt like surrendering a piece of her heart. "As I made clear yesterday, your relationship with my son, whatever you imagine it to be, is over," Harold said, pocketing the key. "Matthew has responsibilities, a future planned out since birth. He will marry someone suitable, someone who can help advance the Blackridge name and fortune." "I understand," Celine whispered. "I don't think you do." Harold leaned forward, his eyes cold. "My son thinks he's in love with you. He's planning to come home, today, to be with you, to throw away everything I've built for him." Celine's heart leapt at the confirmation that Matthew was indeed coming back for her, but she kept her expression neutral. "I can't allow that to happen," Harold continued, "which leaves me with a problem." "I'll resign," Celine offered quickly. "I'll leave today. He won't be able to find me." Harold considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No, Matthew would only search for you. He can be persistent when he wants something." He drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking, "There is another solution, one that would benefit us both. Sir, you need money. For your mother's medical bills, I assume. The treatments that the local clinic can't provide." Selina stared at him in shock. How did he know about her mother? "I make it my business to know everything about the people who work in my home," Harold explained, reading her expression. "Your mother has been ill for some time. Cancer, I believe. The prognosis isn't good without expensive treatments." Celine felt sick. He'd been investigating her, prying into the most painful parts of her life. "I'm prepared to offer you a sum of money," Harold continued. "Enough to get your mother the best care available. Take enough for you to move away from here, start fresh somewhere else." "In exchange for what?" Selina asked, though she already knew the answer. "You will leave Blackridge Manor today. You will not contact my son again. You will not tell him where you're going." Harold's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a business transaction. "Most importantly, you will write him a letter explaining that you don't share his feelings, that what happened between you was a mistake, that you're leaving and don't wish to see him again." Celine felt as if she were drowning. "You want me to break his heart?" "I want to save him from making a terrible mistake," Harold corrected. "One that would haunt both of you for the rest of your lives." He opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. $50,000. More than you could earn in 10 years of service. Enough to give your mother a fighting chance. The amount was staggering. More money than Celine had ever imagined possessing. With it, she could get her mother into the cancer treatment center in the next state, the one with the experimental therapy the local doctor had mentioned. She could pay their rent for months, even years. But the cost. "Well?" Harold prompted, pen poised over the checkbook. "What will it be, Miss Morgan? Your foolish romance or your mother's life?" Celine closed her eyes, Matthew's words echoing in her mind. "What I feel for you is real. More real than anything I've ever felt." But her mother was real too. Her mother's pain, her deteriorating condition, the treatments they couldn't afford, those were painfully, undeniably real. "I'll do it," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Harold nodded, unsurprised, and began writing the check. "A wise decision. Mrs. Winters will provide you with paper and pen. I expect the letter to be convincing. And if I take your money and don't write the letter, or tell Matthew the truth later?" The question slipped out before Celine could stop it. Harold looked up, his expression almost pitying. "Then the check will be cancelled before you can cash it, and I will ensure that neither you nor your mother receives medical care in any reputable facility in this state." His smile was thin. "I have considerable influence, Miss Morgan. It extends far beyond the walls of this house." Celine had no doubt he meant every word. The Blackridge name opened doors and could close them just as easily. 20 minutes later, she sat at the kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper before her, and Mrs. Winters watching from the doorway. The housekeeper's expression was a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. "Don't be too harsh," Mrs. Winters advised, her voice softer than usual. "Me and like Matthew aren't used to rejection. Make it kind but firm." Celine picked up the pen, tears blurring her vision. How could she write words that would hurt him? How could she lie about the feelings that had grown in her heart, against all reason and caution? But the check in her pocket, the hope it represented for her mother, gave her the strength to begin. "Dear Matthew," she wrote, her hand trembling slightly. By the time she finished, tears had smudged, some of the ink, but the message was clear. What had happened between them was a mistake, a fantasy that could never be real. She was leaving, starting a new life elsewhere. He shouldn't try to find her. He should forget her and focus on the future his father had planned for him. Every word was a lie. Every sentence broke her heart a little more. Mrs. Winters read the letter carefully, nodding in approval. "This will do. I'll see that it's placed in his room when he arrives." "He's coming back today?" Celine asked, hope and dread mingling in her chest. "He called from the airport after you hung up. He'll be here by evening." The housekeeper folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. "Which means you should be gone by then. Gather your things and say your goodbyes to the staff if you wish. Then leave your uniform on your way out." An hour later, Celine walked down the long driveway of Blackridge Manor for the last time, wearing her own simple dress, carrying a small bag with her few possessions from the supply closet where she kept her things during work. The check was tucked safely in her pocket, its weight both a blessing and a curse. With it came a chance for her mother and heartbreak for herself and Matthew. As she reached the end of the driveway, she turned for one last look at the grand house with its white columns and sprawling gardens. Somewhere here inside was the drawing room where Matthew had first seen her, where he'd asked, "Where have you been all my life?" Now she had answered that question. She would be nowhere in his life at all. Tears streamed down her face as she turned away, walking toward home, toward her mother, toward a future paid for with lies and broken hearts. She never saw the car that raced past her up the driveway. A sleek black vehicle moving too fast, its driver too impatient to notice the young woman walking away with her head bowed. Matthew had come home early, just as he'd promised. But by the time he found the letter waiting in his room, Celine would be miles away on a bus headed to the next state, her mother beside her, their new life already beginning. A life without Matthew Blackridge. The cancer treatment center was like another world. All gleaming surfaces and hushed voices, doctors in white coats speaking in careful, measured tones about possibilities and percentages. Celine's mother, Elena, sat wide-eyed in the wheelchair as they were given a tour of the facility. "Are you sure we can afford this?" she whispered, clutching Celine's hand. "It looks so expensive." "We can afford it," Celine assured her, the lie settling uncomfortably in her stomach. She had told her mother that she'd received a bonus from the Blackridges, a generous parting gift for her service. It was easier than explaining the truth. They were given a private room with a view of gardens and a fountain. The experimental treatment would begin tomorrow, the doctor explained. It wasn't a guarantee, but for cases like Elena's, there had been promising results. "You're lucky you came to us when you did," the doctor said, reviewing Elena's charts. "A few more months without treatment and I'm not sure we could have helped." The words struck Celine like physical blows. A few more months. If she had waited, if she had chosen love over money, her mother might have died. Later, as Eleanor slept in the comfortable hospital bed, Celine stood by the window watching the sunset, paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her mind wandered back to Blackridge Manor, to Matthew. Had he read her letter by now? Was he angry? Hurt? Did he believe the lies she'd written? A part of her hoped he would see through them, that he would somehow know the truth. But another part, the practical part that had accepted Harold's check, hoped he would believe every word. It would be easier for him to hate her than to pine for her. Days turned into weeks. Elena's treatment was difficult, There were days of terrible nausea, of weakness so profound she could barely lift her head from the pillow. But there were good days too, when color returned to her cheeks and she could sit in the garden, feeling the sun on her face. "You never told me why you really left your job," Elena said one afternoon as they sat together among blooming roses. "It wasn't just a bonus, was it?" Selene looked away. Her mother had always been perceptive. "It's complicated. It's a man, isn't it?" Elena's voice was gentle. "I saw the way you looked at that folk songbook, the way you kept touching that key you wore around your neck before we left." Tears welled in Selene's eyes. "It doesn't matter now. It wasn't meant to be." Elena reached for her daughter's hand. "Tell me about him." And so, sitting in that peaceful garden, Selene finally let the story pour out. Matthew's kindness, the secret notes and gift teas, the midnight meeting, Harold's ultimatum. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "Oh, my darling girl," Elena whispered, her own eyes wet. "You gave up love for me." "I would do it again," Selene said fiercely. "You're my mother. Your life is worth everything to me." Elena shook her head sadly. "No life is worth living if it's built on someone else's sacrifice. You should have told me." "Would you have let me take the money if I had?" "No," Elena admitted. "I would have rather died than see you sell your happiness." "That's why I didn't tell you," Selene said simply. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. "What will you do when I'm better?" Elena finally asked. "Will you try to find him, explain?" Selene shook her head. "I made a promise. And even if I hadn't, what would be the point? He's a Blackridge. By now his father has probably arranged some suitable marriage for him. He's forgotten all about me." But even as she said the words, Selene knew they weren't true. The connection she'd felt with Matthew had been real as the pain that filled her chest whenever she thought of him. That kind of bond didn't disappear easily, no matter how many lies were told to break it. That night, lying in the small cot beside her mother's hospital bed, Selene made a decision. When the treatments were finished, whether they worked or not, she would move them far away. Maybe to the West Coast, where no one knew the Blackridge name, where she could start fresh without the constant fear of running into Matthew or being reminded of what she'd given up. It was the only way she could imagine moving forward. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, as Selene returned from the hospital cafeteria with coffee, she nearly collided with M. And entering her mother's room. "I'm sorry," she began automatically, stepping back. Then she looked up. Standing before her, his blue eyes wide with shock, was Matthew Blackridge. The coffee cup slipped from Selene's fingers, spilling across the polished hospital floor as time seemed to freeze around them. "Selene," Matthew breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "It really is you." She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He looked different somehow, thinner, with shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before. But still handsome, still Matthew. "How?" she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you find me?" His expression hardened slightly. "It wasn't easy. Not after you disappeared without a word. Not after that letter." The coldness in his tone cut Selene deeply, though she knew she deserved it. "Matthew, I can explain." "Explain what? Who you led me on? Made me believe you felt something for me?" His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the hurt beneath the anger. "I came back for you, Selene. I was ready to fight my father, to risk everything, and I found that letter instead." Selene glanced anxiously at her mother's door. "Please, not here. My mother is the reason I found you," Matthew finished. "I hired a private investigator. He traced the check my father wrote to you, $50,000. Was that the price of your affection, Selene? Was that all it took to make you leave?" The unfairness of his accusation stung like a slap. "You don't understand. Then make me understand," he challenged, "because I've spent the last 3 months trying to figure out what was real and what was a lie. Did you ever care for me at all? Or was I just a rich boy you could use to solve your problems?" Tears filled Selene's eyes. "It wasn't like that. I never wanted your money. And yet you took it." His voice was bitter. You took my father's money, and you wrote that letter and you left without looking back. For my mother, Celine finally burst out, unable to bear his accusations any longer. I did it for my mother. She was dying, Matthew. The doctors gave her months without this treatment. Your father knew that. He used it against me. Matthew stared at her, confusion replacing some of the harsh anger in his expression. What are you talking about? What did my father do? Celine took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Can we talk somewhere private? Please. After a moment's hesitation, Matthew nodded. There's a waiting room at the end of the hall. It should be empty this early. The small room was indeed deserted, its uncomfortable chairs arranged around a low table scattered with old magazines. Celine sank into one, suddenly exhausted, while Matthew remained standing, his posture rigid. Tell me everything, he said, from the beginning. And so she did. She told him about his father intercepting his letter, about the garden house phone call that Mrs. Winters had discovered, about being summoned to Harold's study and given an impossible choice. Take the money and write the goodbye letter, or watch her mother die. He investigated me, Celine said, the memory still making her skin crawl. He knew about my mother's cancer, about the treatments we couldn't afford. He used that information to make me leave you. As she spoke, Matthew's expression changed, from suspicion to shock to a cold, quiet fury she'd never seen before. That sounds exactly like something my father would do, he said when she finished, his voice tight. Control through manipulation. It's his specialty. I didn't want to write that letter, Celine whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Every word was a lie. But my mother... I understand, Matthew said, his tone softening as he finally sat down beside her. I would have done the same thing in your position. Family comes first. Relief washed over Celine at his words. You believe me? Of course I do. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. I know you, Celine, better than my father thinks, better perhaps than you realize. The touch of his hand sent electricity up her arm, just as it had all those months ago. I'm so sorry, she whispered, for hurting you. You did what you had to do. His thumb traced circles on her palm. How is your mother now? Is the treatment working? The doctors are hopeful. It's too early to know for sure, but her last scan showed the tumor shrinking. Celine managed a small smile. She's a fighter. Like her daughter, Matthew said softly. The hospital corridor seemed to F4. Ate away as Celine and Matthew sat together, their hands still joined, the truth finally laid bare between them. I never stopped thinking about you, Matthew said, breaking the silence. Even after that letter. Something about it didn't feel right. The words were yours, but the feeling behind them. He shook his head. It didn't match the woman I'd come to know. I was sure I'd never see you again, Celine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father made it very clear what would happen if I tried to contact you. Matthew's jaw tightened. My father has controlled my life for too long, deciding who I should see, who I should marry, how I should live. His fingers squeezed hers gently. But not anymore. A nurse walked past the waiting room, glancing in at them curiously. Celine pulled her hand away, suddenly remembering where they were. I should check on my mother, she said. She'll be wondering where I am. Matthew nodded and stood. Of course. But Celine... He caught her arm as she rose. We're not finished. This conversation, it's not over. The intensity in his eyes made her heart race. I know, she whispered. They walked back to Elena's room together, an awkward tension between them. What happened next? Where could they possibly go from here? Elena was awake when they entered, her thin face lighting up at the sight of her daughter. Then her gaze shifted to Matthew, curiosity replacing her smile. Mom, this is... Celine hesitated, unsure how to introduce him. Matthew Blackridge, he supplied, stepping forward to take Elena's frail hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Morgan. Elena's eyes widened in recognition. The young man from the manor, she said softly. The one who left the folk song book. Matthew looked surprised. Celine told you about me? Only recently, Eleanor replied, her knowing gaze moving between them. Though I suspected there was someone. A mother can tell these things. Selina felt heat rising to her cheeks. Matthew just happened to be visiting someone else at the hospital. We ran into each other by chance. Elena's raised eyebrow made it clear she didn't believe this for a second. What a fortunate coincidence, she said dryly. Matthew smiled, and Celine was struck again by how different he looked. Nigh, not just thinner, but somehow harder. The past months had changed him. Actually, Mrs. Morgan, there was no coincidence, he admitted. I've been looking for your daughter since the day she left. Matthew, Celine warned, not wanting her mother to know the full story, to feel responsible for her choice. But Elena was already nodding slowly. I thought as much. And now that you've found her, what are your intentions, Mr. Blackridge? Mom, Celine exclaimed, mortified. Matthew didn't seem bothered by the direct question. My intentions are honorable, Mrs. Morgan. I care deeply for your daughter, more than I can express. And your father? Elena asked shrewdly. I understand he has other plans for you. Matthew's expression darkened. My father no longer dictates my life. In fact, he glanced at Celine. There have been some significant changes at Blackridge Manor since you left. What kind of changes? Celine asked, both curious and apprehensive. Before Matthew could answer, a doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. Good morning, Mrs. Morgan. Time for your treatment. He glanced at Matthew. Family only during procedures, I'm afraid. Of course. Matthew nodded politely. He turned to Celine. I'll wait outside. Actually, Elena spoke up, my daughter could use some fresh air. She's been cooped up in this room with me for days. Perhaps you could taxi her to the garden while I have my treatment. Celine opened her mouth to protest, but the look in her mother's eyes silenced her. Elena was playing matchmaker, subtly pushing her daughter toward the man she'd sacrificed so much to leave behind. I'd be happy to, Matthew agreed. If that's all right with Celine? Put on the spot, she could only nod. I'll be back soon, Mom. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Take your time, dear. These treatments last at least an hour. Outside, the hospital garden was in full bloom, a riot of colors and scents that felt at odds with the sterile environment inside. Celine and Matthew walked in silence for a while, following a winding path between flower beds. Your mother seems like a remarkable woman, Matthew finally said. She is, Celine agreed. She's been through so much, but she never complains, never gives up. Like her daughter. Celine shook her head. I gave up on us pretty quickly. Matthew stopped walking, turning to face her. You didn't give up, Celine. You made an impossible choice. There's a difference. A bench sat beneath a flowering dogwood tree, offering some privacy from the few other patients and visitors in the garden. Matthew gestured to it, and they sat down, a careful distance between them. You mentioned changes at Blackridge Manor, Celine prompted, both dreading and needing to know what had happened after her she left. Matthew's expression grew serious. Yes, significant ones. He took a deep breath. My father and I had a confrontation when I found your letter. I knew something wasn't right. The words didn't sound like you, and the timing, right after our phone call, was too convenient. What did you do? Celine asked, a knot forming in her stomach. I accused him of interfering, of driving you away somehow. Matthew's hands tightened into fists in his lap. He denied it at first, but I could see the truth in his eyes. Finally, he admitted that he'd convinced you to leave, though he wouldn't say how. That's when things escalated. Escalated how? I told him I was done. Done with his manipulation, done with his control over my life. Done with the Blackridge Empire, if that's what it took. Matthew's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. I walked out that night, left everything behind. Celine stared at him in shock. You left? Where did you go? New York at first. I had an apartment there, connections from the business. He smiled ruefully. For the first time in my life, I was completely on my own. No servants, no family name opening doors for me. It was enlightening. And your father, what did he do? Matthew's expression hardened. He cut me off. Financially, emotionally, completely. Told the board of directors I was having a nervous breakdown. tried to have me removed from my positions in the company. His smile turned grim. But he forgot one thing. My mother left me shares in the company that he can't touch. Not enough to control Blackridge Enterprises, but enough to make me impossible to ignore. So you've been fighting with your father for control of the company. Celine tried to make sense of it all. Not exactly. I've been fighting for my independence. Matthew turned to face her more fully. I don't care about the Blackridge fortune, Celine. I never have. But I do care about doing what's right. And my father, he's made some questionable decisions over the years, decisions I can no longer support. Celine was still trying to process everything. And now? What's happening now? Now there's an uneasy truce. I'm back on the board, working from the New York office. My father remains CEO, but his power is more limited than before. Matt. Hayo's expression softened as he looked at her. But business isn't why I'm here, Celine. I'm here because I couldn't stop thinking about you, because something about that letter felt wrong, because... He hesitated, vulnerability flashing in his eyes. Because I love you, still, despite everything. The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Matthew, Celine began, her heart racing. You don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I know this is sudden. I know you've been focused on your mother's treatment. I just needed you to know the truth. All of it. Celine looked down at her hands, emotions warring within her. Joy at seeing him again, at knowing he still cared, fear of what it might mean, of history repeating itself, and guilt, always guilt, over the choice she'd made. What happens now? She finally asked, her voice small. That's up to you, Matthew said. I won't pressure you, Celine. Your mother's health comes first. I understand that, but I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me, in whatever way you're comfortable with. My mother's treatment is expensive, Celine admitted. The money your father gave me, it won't last forever. Let me help, Matthew said immediately. Please, it would mean... No, Celine interrupted firmly. I can't take money from you, Matthew. It would feel too much like what happened with our father, like I'm being bought. He looked hurt for a moment, then nodded slowly. I understand, but will you at least let me visit? Get to know your mother better. Be your... friend, if nothing else. Friend. The word felt inadequate for what they'd shared, for the connection that still hummed between them even now. But it was a start, a way forward. Yes, Celine said softly. I'd like that. The relief on Matthew's face was palpable. Thank you. He glanced at his watch. I should probably let you get back to your mother, but I'll come again tomorrow, if that's all right. Tomorrow, Celine agreed, a small smile tugging at her lips despite everything. As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, Matthew's hand brushed against hers, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. Either way, the brief contact sent a familiar warmth spreading through her. Whatever happened next, Celine knew one thing for certain. Matthew Blackridge had found his way back into her life, and this time, she wasn't sure she had the strength or the desire to let him go. True to his word, Matthew returned the next day, and the day after that. Soon his visits became a regular part of life at the treatment center. He brought books for Celine, flowers for Elena, and a warmth that made the sterile hospital room feel almost like home. Elena took to him immediately, her sharp eyes noting the way he looked at her daughter when he thought no one was watching. That young man is in love with you, she told Celine one evening after Matthew had left. Completely, utterly in love. Mom, please, Celine protested weakly. It's complicated. Love often is, Elena replied with the wisdom of experience, but that doesn't make it any less real. As the days passed, Celine found herself looking forward to Matthew's visits more and more. They would walk in the garden, talking about everything and nothing, her childhood in the small apartment with Elena, his years at boarding schools and universities. She told him about her struggles with reading, how she'd had to drop out of school to work when her mother first got sick. He confessed his loneliness growing up in the grand, empty rooms of Blackridge Manor with a father who saw him as an heir rather than a son. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt the connection that had begun in that sun-drenched drawing room months ago. But this time, it was deeper, more honest. No more notes and secret meetings, just two people learning each other, one conversation at a time. 2 weeks after their reunion, Elena's doctor called them both into his office. His expression was serious as they took seats across from his desk. "The treatment has been partially successful," he began, getting straight to the point. "The tumor has shrunk significantly, which is excellent news." "But," Celine prompted, hearing the unspoken qualification in his tone, "but we're seeing some concerning results in your mother's latest blood work. The cancer may be spreading to other organs despite the treatment." He shuffled some papers on his desk. "There's a new trial starting at Memorial Hospital in New York. It's specifically designed for cases like your mother's. I'd like to refer her if you're open to it." "New York?" Celine repeated, her mind racing. "We'd have to move again. How soon?" "Ideally, within the next 2 weeks. The trial has limited spots, and they're filling quickly." Matthew, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "What are the costs associated with this trial, Doctor?" The doctor hesitated. "The experimental treatment itself is covered by the research grant, but there would be additional expenses, accommodations in New York, supplementary medications, caregiving support." "I see," Matthew said thoughtfully. After the doctor provided more details about the trial, they thanked him and left his office, both lost in thought as they walked back to Elena's room. "New York," Selene said again, the reality sinking in. "I don't know if we can afford to live there, even temporarily. The money from your father—" She trailed off, not wanting to discuss it. "Is running out," Matthew finished for her. "I suspected as much." They reached Elena's room, but Matthew gently caught Celine's arm before she could enter. "Wait, let me say something first." Celine turned to face him, noting the determination in his eyes. "I have an apartment in New York, a large one with plenty of space. It's sitting empty right now because I've been staying in hotels here to be near you." He took a deep breath. "I want you and your mother to stay there during her treatment." "Matthew, I already told you." "This isn't about money, Celine," he interrupted. "This is about practicality, about giving your mother the best chance. The apartment is paid for. It's close to Memorial Hospital. It has an elevator and all the amenities that would make her comfortable." Selena hesitated, torn between pride and pragmatism. "I don't want to be indebted to you." "You wouldn't be," Matthew insisted. "Think of it as a loan. You can pay rent when you're back on your feet, whatever makes you comfortable." His eyes softened. "Please, Celine, let me do this one thing. Not because I'm trying to buy your affection, but because I care about both of you." Put that way, how could she refuse? Especially when Elena's life hung in the balance. "I'll think about it," she finally conceded. "And I'll talk to my mother." Matthew nodded, understanding this was as close to acceptance as he'd get for now. "That's all I ask." When they told Elena about the New York trial, her reaction surprised them both. "Well, of course we'll go," she said firmly. "I'm not ready to give up just yet." "Mom, it's not that simple," Celine began. "New York is expensive, and Matthew has offered us his apartment," Elena finished, looking at the young man with knowing eyes, "which we will gratefully accept." "How did you—" Celine sputtered. "These walls are thin, dear," Elena said with a small smile. "And you two weren't exactly whispering." Matthew looked amused. "So you approve, Mrs. Morgan?" "I approve of anything that gives me more time with my daughter," Elena replied. Then, more softly, "and with the potential son-in-law I'm just getting to know." "Mom!" Celine exclaimed, mortified. But Matthew just laughed, the sound warming the hospital room. "I hope I can live up to that potential, Mrs. Morgan." 2 weeks later, they were on a plane to New York, Eleanor resting comfortably in first class thanks to Matthew's insistence on upgrading their tickets. Celine sat beside her mother, watching the clouds out the window, still barely able to believe how much her life had changed in such a short time. Matthew's apartment turned out to be a stunning penthouse in a luxury building with doorman and a concierge. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Central Park, and the space was large enough that Elena could have her own bedroom and bathroom. "This is where you live?" Celine asked in disbelief as they entered the marble-floored foyer. "It's bigger than our entire apartment building back home." Matthew shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. It's just a place I'm rarely here, to be honest. A housekeeper had prepared everything for their arrival. Fresh flowers in every room, the kitchen stocked with food, the beds made up with crisp linens. Elena was settled into her room for a nap, exhausted from the journey. Alone in the massive living room, Celine felt out of place among the expensive furniture and art. "This is too much, Matthew." "It's not enough," H.E. replied simply. "Not for what you deserve." The intensity in his gaze made her look away. 3 weeks had passed since their reunion at the hospital, and while they had grown closer, they had carefully avoided crossing the line from friendship back into romance. But moments like this, when he looked at her that way, made it increasingly difficult to remember why that line existed at all. "I should unpack," Celine said, needing some distance to clear her hiad. "And check on Mom." Matthew nodded, respecting her need for space. "Of course. I have some business to attend to at the office anyway. I'll come back this evening if that's all right. We can have dinner together, all 3 of us." "That would be nice," Celine agreed. After he left, she wandered through the apartment, taking in the luxury that Matthew seemed to take for granted. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with appliances she didn't even recognize. Teehee bathrooms featured marble and heated floors. The closets in her bedroom were larger than her entire room back home. It was another world, Matthew's world, and she felt like an imposter in it. Eleanor's treatments at Memorial Hospital began the next day. The new trial was more aggressive than the previous one, leaving her mother exhausted and nauseous. But the doctors were optimistic, noting that Elena was responding well to the protocol. Days fell into a routine, mornings at the hospital, afternoons resting at the apartment. Matthew came by most evenings, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes cooking himself, a skill that surprised Celine until he admitted he'd taken classes during his rebellion against his father. "I wanted to learn to be self-sufficient," he explained, as he stirred a pot of pasta sauce one evening. "To prove I could survive without servants and family money." "And can you?" Selina asked, genuinely curious. He smiled ruefully. "I'm learning. I can make 5 dishes without burning anything, do my own laundry, and I've only locked myself out of my apartment twice." Celine laughed, the sound filling the kitchen. It felt good to laugh, a rare pleasure in the midst of worry about her mother and uncertainty about the future. Matthew looked at her, his eyes warm. "I love that sound," he said softly. "Your laugh. It's like music." The moments stretched ahead between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then the timer on the stove beeped, breaking the spell. "Sauce is ready," Matthew said, turning back to the stove. Later that night, after Matthew had gone and Elena was asleep, Celine stood at the living room window, looking out at the glittering cityscape. New York was beautiful at night, all lights and possibility. So different from the small town she'd grown up in, where everyone knew their place and rah-rely rose above it. Here, in this city, in this apartment, she could almost believe that fairy tales were possible, that a girl who cleaned floors could end up with the heir to a fortune, that love could bridge the gap between their worlds. Almost, but reality had a way of intruding on even the most beautiful dreams. And reality came calling the very next day, in the form of Harold Blackridge. Celine had just returned from the hospital, Eleanor resting in her room after another exhausting treatment, when the doorman called up to announce a visitor. "Mr. Harold Blackridge is here to see you, Miss Morgan," he said, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Shall I send him up?" Celine's blood ran cold. How had he found them? What did he want? And most importantly, how could she protect her mother from this man who had already caused so much pain? "Yes," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Send him up." She straightened her simple dress, wishing she looked more composed, less vulnerable. The doorbell rang just minutes later. Harold Blackridge hadn't changed, still tall and imposing, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit impeccable, but there were new lines around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth that spoke of recent stress. "Miss Morgan," he said coolly as she let him in, "how domestic you look." Celine lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated in spite of her racing heart. "What are you doing here, Mr. Blackridge?" "I think you know." He stepped past her into the apartment, his critical gaze sweeping over the space. My son has always had excellent taste in real estate, if questionable taste in other areas. The insult stung, but Celine didn't rise to the bait. Matthew isn't here. I'm aware. I timed my visit specifically to catch you alone. Harold moved to the window, looking out at the view wit. Saw his hands clasped behind his back. This has gone on long enough, don't you think? What has? He turned to face her, his expression hard. This, whatever it is between you and my son, this fantasy he's indulging in. It's not a fantasy, Celine said, her voice stronger than she felt. And it's not up to you to decide when it's gone on long enough. No? Harold raised an eyebrow. The last time we spoke, you seemed quite willing to let me make the tea decision. $50,000, as I recall. A sum that must be nearly depleted by now, given your mother's medical expenses. Celine flinched. How do you know about that? I make it my business to know things, Miss Morgan, especially when they concern my son and his distractions. He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an envelope. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. He held out the envelope. When Celine made no move to take it, H.E. placed it on the coffee table between them. Inside is a check for $250,000, he said matter-of-factly. 5 times my previous offer. Enough to pay for your mother's treatments for years to come. Enough for you to buy a modest home somewhere, start a new life. Celine stared at the envelope, a bitter taste in her mouth. And in exchange? You disappear from my son's life. Permanently this time. Harold's voice was cold, Business-like. No tearful goodbyes, no explanations. You simply vanish. Today. You really think I'd do that to him again? Celine asked, anger rising within her. After everything that's happened? I think you're a practical young woman who understands the realities of your situation. Harold's gaze was unflinching. Your mother is gravely ill. The experimental treatment she's receiving is promising but not guaranteed. And when it ends, whether successful or not, what then? Will you continue to live off my son's charity? Become his kept woman? His mistress, perhaps? Each word was like a slap. That's not what this is, Celine protested. Isn't it? Harold challenged. You're living in his apartment, eating food he provides. Your mother is receiving treatment at a hospital where the Blackridge name opened doors for you. How is that not charity? Celine had no answer because the cruel truth was that he was right. Despite her best intentions, despite her refusal to take money directly from Matthew, she had ended up depending on him completely. Matthew doesn't see it that way, she finally said. Of course he doesn't. He's young, idealistic, blinded by whatever charms you possess. Harold's dismissive gaze swept over her. But reality will set in eventually. The novelty will wear off. And when it does, where will that leave you and your mother? He moved Clow. Sir, his voice dropping. Take the money, Miss Morgan. Save yourself and your mother the inevitable pain of watching Matthew tire of playing savior. Save my son the embarrassment of eventually having to extricate himself from this situation. Celine felt sick, his words striking at her deepest insecurities. Wasn't this exactly what she'd feared from the beginning? That the difference in their positions, their backgrounds, would eventually prove too great to overcome. Why are you really here, Mr. Blackridge? She asked quietly. Is it because you're so concerned about your son's happiness? Or is it because he's finally standing up to you, making his own choices and you can't stand it? Anger flashed in Harold's eyes, so quickly she almost missed it. My son is the heir to a fortune and a business empire that has stood for generations. His choices affect more than just himself. And your choices? Celine challenged. What about when you fell in love with a shop girl? When you married Matthew's mother against your family's wishes? Was that a mistake too? Harold's face went rigid. How do you know about that? Mrs. Winters told me, right before she helped you drive me away the first time. Celine took a deep breath, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. You loved someone from the wrong side of the tracks once, someone your family didn't approve of. What happened, Mr. Blackridge? What made you become the very thing you once fought against? For a moment, just a moment, something like pain flashed across Harold's face. Then the mask slipped back into place. "You know nothing about my marriage or my wife," he said coldly, "and this conversation is becoming pointless. My offer stands. The money for your permanent absence from my son's life. Think about your mother, Miss Morgan, about her future." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. If you're still here when Matthew returns from his business trip, the offer is withdrawn, permanently." With that he left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded as final as a gunshot. Celine sank onto the couch, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The envelope sat on the coffee table, innocent-looking but full of impossible choices. $250,000. Enough to secure her mother's future, regardless of how the experimental treatment turned out. Enough to start over somewhere new, without depending on Matthew's charity. But at what cost? She had already broken Matthew's heart once, forced by circumstance and Harold's manipulation. Could she do it again, this time by choice? Could she vanish from his life without explanation, leaving him to wonder what he'd done wrong? The very thought made her chest ache. In the weeks since their reunion, her feelings for Matthew had only grown stronger. What had begun as attraction and connection had deepened into something she could no longer deny, even to herself. She loved him, completely, irrevocably. But Harold's words echoed in her mind. Was she taking advantage of Matthew's generosity? Would he eventually come to resent her dependence on him? And what about her mother? Didn't Elena deserve the best care possible, the security that Harold's money could provide? Celine was still sitting there, lost in her impossible dilemma, when her mother's voice called softly from the hallway. "Celine, is everything all right? I thought I heard voices." Eleanor stood in the doorway to her room, looking frail in her robe, her once dark hair now almost completely grey. The sight of her mother, still fighting, still here despite everything, brought tears to Celine's eyes. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." Eleanor crossed to the couch slowly, sitting beside her daughter. "Tell me," she said simply. And so Celine did, explaining Harold's visit, his offer, the choice she now faced. As she spoke, Eleanor's expression grew increasingly troubled. "So this is the man who forced you to write that letter," she said when Celine finished, "who made you leave the man you loved." "He didn't force me," Celine corrected gently. "He offered me a choice, just like he's doing now." "That's not a choice, darling. It's manipulation." Elena's voice was surprisingly strong. "And I won't let you sacrifice your happiness for me. Not again." "Mom, no, Celine. Listen to me." Elena took her daughter's hands in hers. "I've lived my life, had my loves, my heartbreaks, my joys. Now it's your turn, and if Matthew Blackridge makes you happy, if he's the man you want to build a life with, then his father's money means nothing. But your treatment will continue," Elena said firmly. "Matthew has already arranged everything, and if the worst happens," her voice softened, "if this treatment doesn't work, then I'll go knowing my daughter is loved, truly loved. That's worth more than any amount of money Harold Blackridge could offer." Tears spilled down Celine's cheeks. "I'm scared, Mom. What if he's right? What if Matthew eventually realizes I don't belong in his world?" Elena wiped away her daughter's tears with a gentle hand. "Love creates its own world, Celine. Your father was a janitor when I met him, did you know that? Working nights at the school where I taught music. Everyone said we didn't match, that it wouldn't last." A sad smile touched her lips. "We had 15 beautiful years before the accident took him from us. 15 years of happiness I wouldn't trade for anything." Celine had heard so little about her father over the years, the subject too painful for her mother to discuss. This glimpse into her parents' love story touched something deep within her. "What should I do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. Eleanor nodded toward the envelope on the coffee table. "First, you get rid of that. Then you tell Matthew everything. No more secrets, no more letting other people come between you." Celine took a deep breath, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Okay." As if on cue, the front door opened and Matthew's voice called out, "Celine." "Elena, I'm back early. The meeting in Boston was cancelled. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. Perfect timing, she whispered with a knowing smile. Matthew appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up at the sight of them. Then his expression changed as he registered Celine's tear-stained face. "What's wrong?" he asked, instantly concerned. "Is it the treatment? Did something happen?" Celine stood, gathering her courage. "Your father was here." Matthew's expression hardened. "My father? What did he want?" Celine gestured to the envelope on the coffee table. "He brought that. For me." Matthew crossed to the table and picked up the envelope, opening it to reveal the check inside. His face went still as he read the amount. $250,000, he said flatly. "Let me guess, in exchange for disappearing from my life." Celine nodded, watching him anxiously. Matthew tore the check in half, then in quarters, his movements controlled, but his eyes blazing with anger. "I'm going to put a stop to this once and for all." "Matthew, wait," Celine said, catching his arm as he turned to leave. "There's something I need to tell you first, something I should have said weeks ago." He paused, looking down at her, the anger in his eyes softening slightly. "I love you," she said simply. "I have since that day in the drawing room, when you asked where I'd been all your life, and I'm tired of letting your father, or my fears, or anything else stand in the way of that truth." The transformation in Matthew's face was immediate, anger giving way to wonder, to joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he might never let go. "Say it again," he whispered against her hair. "I love you," Celine repeated, the words easier now, natural as breathing. "I love you, Matthew Blackridge." "And I love you," he said, drawing back just enough to look into her eyes. "More than I thought it was possible to love another person." He kissed her then, tenderly at first, then with increasing passion, a kiss that spoke of weeks of restraint, of feelings too long kept in check. Celine melted into him, all her doubts forgotten in the rightness of being in his arms. A soft clearing of a throat reminded them they weren't alone. They broke apart to find Elena watching them with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. "I think I'll rest in my room for a while," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You two clearly have some catching up to do." As Elena disappeared down the hallway, Matthew turned back to Selina, his expression serious despite the joy still evident in his eyes. "We need to talk about my father," he said. "About what happens next." Selina nodded, knowing this conversation couldn't be avoided. "What does happen next, Matthew? He'll never accept me, never accept us." "Then he'll have to live with that disappointment," Matthew said firmly. "Because I'm not letting you go again, not for him, not for anyone." He led her to the couch, sitting close enough that their knees touched, his hands holding hers. "I've been wanting to tell you something for weeks," he began, "waiting for the right moment. But maybe there is no right moment, just the truth that needs to be said." Matthew took a deep breath, his hands tightening slightly around Celine's. "I've been making changes, big ones since I found you again, preparing for a future I hoped we might share." "What kind of changes?" Celine asked, both curious and apprehensive. "I've been gradually selling my shares in Blackridge Enterprises," he said, "using the money to start something of my own, something separate from my father's influence." Celine stared at him in shock. "You're giving up your inheritance? Your position in the company?" "Not giving up," Matthew corrected. "Transforming. Building something that's truly mine, not just handed to me because of my last name." His eyes searched hers. "I want to create a foundation that helps people access medical care they couldn't otherwise afford. People like your mother." "A foundation?" Celine repeated. "True," Ying to process what he was saying. "Yes, the initial funding would come from my Blackridge shares, but eventually it would be self-sustaining." His voice grew more animated as he explained. "We'd partner with hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, create a network that ensures no one has to choose between medical care and financial ruin." The passion in his voice was captivating. This wasn't the impulsive gesture of a rich man's son, but a carefully considered plan born of genuine conviction. "When did you start planning this?" Celine asked. "After I found that letter," Matthew admitted. When I thought I'd lost you, I was angry at my father, at the world, at the system that forces people to make impossible choices between love and survival. He squeezed her hands. I wanted to create something that might prevent others from facing the choice you had to make. Tears welled in Selina's eyes. You did this because of me. You were the catalyst, he said softly. But the more I researched, the more I realized how many people struggle to afford basic medical care. How many families are bankrupted by illness? It became something bigger than us. Your father must be furious, Celine said, thinking of Harold's controlling nature. He doesn't know yet, Matthew replied. Not the full extent of it anyway. He knows I've sold some shares, but he thinks it's just a phase, my way of asserting independence. A thought occurred to Celine. Is that why you were in Boston? For the foundation? Matthew nodded. Meeting with potential partners. The pieces are falling into place faster than I expected. He hesitated, then continued. There's an office in New York, but the main headquarters will be in a smaller city, somewhere costs are reasonable but with good medical facilities nearby. Like back home, Celine said, thinking of the town they'd left behind. Exactly like back home, Matthew agreed, his eyes intent on hers. Which brings me to the question I've been wanting to ask you. He slid from the couch to one knee before her, still holding her hands. Celine's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. Celine Morgan, Matthew said, his voice filled with emotion. I fell in love with you in a dusty drawing room when you thought no one was watching. I've loved you through separation, through pain, through my father's interference and your own doubts, and I want to keep loving you every day for the rest of our lives. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, not an ostentatious diamond, but a delicate band set with a single violet stone, deep purple and gleaming in the afternoon light. Will you marry me? He asked simply. Build this life with me. Start this foundation together as partners in every sense. Celine stared at the ring, at the earnest face of the man she loved, and felt the last of her reservations melt away. This wasn't about wealth or class or the differences between them. This was about two people who had found each other against all odds, who had fought for a chance at happiness. Yes, she whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. Yes, I'll marry you. Matthew's face lit up with pure happiness as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was pulling her into his arms, kissing her with a promise of all the days to come. A soft noise from the hallway made them break apart. Eleanor stood there, tears in her eyes, but a radiant smile on her face. I'm sorry, she said. I couldn't help overhearing, and I couldn't stay away. Matthew rose, extending his hand to Celine's mother. Elena, he said warmly, I should have asked for your blessing first. You have it, Elena assured him, taking his hand. You've had it since the moment I saw how you look at my daughter. The three of them stood together in the sunlit apartment, a new family formed in the midst of challenges and obstacles, but their moment of joy was interrupted by the harsh sound of the doorbell. Matthew's expression darkened. That's probably my father, he said grimly, coming to see if his latest chemie worked. We'll face him together, Celine said, squeezing his hand. Matthew nodded, then moved to the door. When he opened it, Harold Blackridge stood in the hallway, his face set in stern lines. Hello, Father, Matthew said coldly. I believe we need to talk. Harold's gaze moved past his son to where Celine stood, her hand still in Elena's. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the ring glinting on her finger. I see Miss Morgan has made her choice, H.E. said, his voice clipped, though not the wise one. The only wise choice was following her heart, Elena spoke up, her voice surprisingly strong. Something you might have forgotten how to do, Mr. Blackridge. Harold's attention shifted to Elena, his expression changing subtly. You must be Celine's mother. Eleanor Morgan, she confirmed with quiet dignity. The reason your money and threats had power over my daughter, but not anymore. Matthew stepped aside, his gesture making it clear that Harold was being invited in, not because he was welcome, but because this confrontation was necessary. Harold entered the apartment, his tall figure somehow less imposing than it had seemed earlier. He looked tired, Celine thought. Older. You tore up my check, he observed, noticing the pieces still scattered on the coffee table. Did you really think money would work a second time? Matthew asked. I had hoped reason might prevail, Harold replied stiffly. That Miss Morgan might consider the practical implications of this attachment. Love, Matthew corrected. Call it what it is, Father. Celine and I love each other, and we're getting married. Harold's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. Just as He stopped abruptly. Just as you did, Elena finished softly. When you married a shop girl against your family's wishes. Something flashed in Harold's eyes, pain, perhaps, or memory. My marriage is not relevant to this discussion. Isn't it? Matthew challenged. You've spent my entire life trying to erase Mother's background, pretending she came from the right family, the right circles, making her change the way she spoke, the way she dressed, forcing her to cut ties with her own family. Celine watched Harold's face, seeing cracks appear in his composed facade. This was clearly a wound that had never healed. I was protecting her, Harold said, his voice strained, from the cruelty of our social circle, from the whispers and stares and subtle exclusions. Did she ask for that protection? Elena asked gently. Or did you decide it was necessary without consulting her? Harold turned away, moving to the window. For a long moment he stared out at the city below, his back rigid. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, almost vulnerable. She was like a breath of fresh air, he said, so softly they had to strain to hear him. Working in that little bookshop where I stopped to escape a rainstorm, no pretense, no agenda, just real. He turned back to face them. But the world I brought her into wasn't kind to people who were real. It chipped away at her bit by bit, the comments, the snubs, the constant scrutiny. So you tried to change her, Matthew said, understanding dawning in his eyes. To protect her from that scrutiny. I thought I was helping, Harold admitted, making it easier for her to fit in, to be accepted. His gaze dropped. By the time I realized what it was doing to her, to us, it was too late. She grew to resent me, to see me as her jailer rather than her husband. What happened to her? Celine asked softly. Matthew had never spoken much about his mother, and she'd assumed the topic was too painful. Harold's face closed off again. She left 20 years ago. Couldn't bear the life we'd built anymore. His voice turned bitter. Last I heard, she was living in some artist colony in New Mexico, painting, writing poetry, being her authentic self, as she put it in her goodbye letter. The revelation hung in the air. Matthew stared at his father, shock evident on his face. She's alive? He finally managed. All this time, you told me she died, that the depression took her. It was easier than the truth, Harold said, not meeting his son's eyes, that she chose freedom over us, over you. No, Matthew said, anger rising in his voice. She chose freedom over you, over what you tried to make her become. And you've been punishing me and every woman I've ever cared about for her choice ever since. Harold didn't deny it. I was trying to protect you from making the same mistake. The mistake wasn't falling in love with someone from a different background, Matthew said fiercely. The mistake was trying to force that person to become someone they weren't, to deny their essence, the very thing you fell in love with in the first place. Celine moved to Matthew's side, taking his hand. She could feel the tremors running through him, anger, pain, shock at learning his mother was still alive after believing her dead for 20 years. Mr. Blackridge, she said quietly, I love your son, not for his money or his name, but for his heart. For the man who sees me, really sees me when I thought I was invisible. And I love Celine for exactly who she is, Matthew added. I don't want to change her. I don't want to improve her or make her fit some mold of what a Blackridge wife should be. Harold looked between them, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. You sound like me, he said to Matthew, 30 years ago defying my father to marry your mother. Then learn from your mistakes, Matthew urged. Don't force me to choose between my family and the woman I love, because I will choose her, Father. Every time. A heavy silence fell over the room. Eleanor had moved to sit on the couch, the emotional confrontation clearly taxing her limited strength. Celine glanced at her mother with concern, then back at Harold. "Your son is building something remarkable," she told him. "A foundation that will help people like my mother access medical care they couldn't otherwise afford. He's using his privilege and resources to make real change in the world." Her voice softened. "Isn't that something to be proud of, rather than fight against?" Harold looked at his son with new eyes. "A foundation? Is that what you've been working on?" Matthew nodded. "It's why I've been selling my shares, to fund it independently, without Blackridge Enterprises' involvement." "Without my involvement, you mean?" Harold said, a hint of hurt in his tone. "You've made it clear you don't approve of my choices," Matthew replied. "Of Celine, I didn't see how we could work together." Harold was silent for a long moment, conflict evident on his face. Then he looked at Eleanor, sitting pale but dignified on the couch. "Your treatment," he said abruptly. "Is it helping?" The sudden change of subject surprised everyone, but Eleanor answered calmly. "The doctors are cautiously optimistic. The trial is showing promising results." Harold nodded, as if confirming something to himself. Then he turned back to Matthew. "This foundation of yours, it would help people access experimental treatments, clinical trials?" "Among other things, yes," Matthew said warily. "Why?" "Because Blackridge Pharmaceuticals has 3 promising cancer drugs in development," Harold said. "Treatments that could be game changers if they pass clinical trials. Perhaps there could be a partnership." Matthew stared at his father in disbelief. "Are you offering to help?" "I'm offering to listen," Harold corrected, his tone careful. "To understand what you're building before I dismiss it. That seems reasonable." It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't approval, but it was a starting point, an opening where before there had been only walls. "I think that sounds very reasonable," Elena spoke up, her gentle voice breaking the tension. "Perhaps over dinner. I find people are always more civil with food in front of them." Harold looked at her in surprise, then something almost like a smile tugged at his lips. "A diplomatic suggestion, Mrs. Morgan." "Eleanor, please," she corrected. "If our children are to marry, we should at least be on a first-name basis, don't you think?" The simple statement, so matter-of-fact, so accepting, seemed to disarm Harold further. "Eleanor," he conceded with a small nod. Then, after a hesitation, "Harold." Matthew and Celine exchanged a look of cautious hope. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Harold Blackridge was not suddenly transformed into a loving, accepting father. But it was a crack in the fortress he'd built, a willingness to at least consider a different path forward. Dinner that evening was a strange affair, tense at times with long silences and careful conversation. But by the end, as Harold prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "The ring," he said, nodding toward Celine's hand. "It was your mother's favorite, not her engagement ring. That was a family heirloom she never liked. But this one, I gave it to her on our 5th anniversary." Matthew looked stunned. "I found it in a box of her things in the attic. I had no idea." "She left it behind," Harold said, an old pain evident in his voice. "Along with everything else I'd given her." He turned to go, then stopped again. "The foundation. Send me the business plan. I'll review it." It wasn't much, but it was something. After he left, Matthew pulled Celine into his arms. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "I think so," she replied, still processing the strange evening. "Your father is not what I expected." "He's a complicated man," Matthew said, his expression thoughtful. "Damaged in ways I'm only beginning to understand." He shook his head. "I can't believe my mother is alive, that she's been out there all this time." "Will you try to find her?" Celine asked. "Yes," he said firmly, "as soon as possible. She deserves to know about us, about the foundation." His eyes softened. "About you?" Eleanor, watching them from the couch, smiled tiredly. "A good day," she murmured, "full of revelations and new beginnings." Celine moved to her mother's side, concerned by her pallor. "You should rest, Mom. It's been an emotional day for everyone." "Worth every minute," Elena assured her, patting her hand. "To see you happy, to know you'll be taken care of when I'm gone." "Don't talk like that," Celine protested. "The treatment is working. You heard what the doctor said." I heard, Eleanor agreed, but I'm not a fool, darling. I know the odds. She glanced at Matthew, who had moved to stand beside Celine. Promise me you'll take care of my girl. With everything I am, Matthew vowed, his voice solemn. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. Then I can rest easy, whatever happens. The weeks that followed brought changes, some expected, some surprising. Eleanor's treatment continued, with days of improvement followed by setbacks that left her weaker each time. But she remained determined, her spirit undiminished even as her body failed her. Harold became a regular visitor, his initial stiffness gradually giving way to a cautious involvement in their lives. He reviewed Matthew's foundation plans and, to everyone's shock, offered not just support but additional funding and connections. "It's a sound business model," he said gruffly when Matthew expressed surprise. "And it has merit. Socially, I mean." Celine suspected there was more to it, that watching Elena's battle with cancer had affected Harold more deeply than he would admit. He often brought books for Elena, sitting with her while Celine and Matthew were at foundation meetings, discussing literature and art and music. An unlikely friendship formed between them, built on mutual respect and perhaps a shared understanding of time's precious nature. One evening, returning from a doctor's appointment, Celine and Matthew found them laughing together over old photographs, pictures of a young Harold and a beautiful woman with wild, dark hair and a free-spirited smile. "Matthew's mother," Harold explained, something like nostalgia in his voice, "before everything changed." "She's lovely," Eleanor said, studying the photos. "She has Matthew's eyes. And his stubborn streak," Harold added with a rueful smile, "though he gets his business sense from me." It was the most open he'd been about Lillian Blackridge, a name that had been almost forbidden in the past. Another wall coming down brick by brick. The wedding plans were simple by Blackridge standards, a small ceremony in the hospital garden, scheduled for when Elena was feeling her strongest. Celine had no interest in a grand society affair, and Matthew wanted only what would make her happy. 2 days before the wedding, the letter arrived, postmarked from New Mexico, addressed to Matthew in unfamiliar handwriting. "It's from my mother," he said, his voice shaking slightly as he showed Celine the return address. "She's coming to the wedding." Harold had found her, reaching out after all these years of silence, swallowing his pride to tell her about their son's engagement. It was perhaps the greatest gift he could have given, though he brushed off Matthew's gratitude with characteristic gruffness. "She's your mother," he said simply. "She should be there." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the hospital garden in full bloom. Elena was having a good day, one of her best in weeks, seated in a place of honor in her wheelchair, her face glowing with happiness as she watched her daughter prepare. "You look beautiful," she told Selina, tears in her eyes as she adjusted the simple veil, "like an angel." Celine's dress was elegant but understated, ivory silk that flowed around her like water. No grand train or elaborate beading, just clean lines that complemented her natural beauty. Around her neck hung a small locket containing a pressed violet, a reminder of where their story began. Matthew waited beneath an arch of roses, his face lighting up as Celine appeared on Harold's arm. The older Blackridge had surprised them by offering to walk her down the aisle, a gesture that had moved Celine deeply. "You've made my son happier than I've ever seen him," Harold had said when he asked. "It would be my honor." The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the small gathering of friends and hospital staff watching as they exchanged vows and rings. But the most emotional moment came afterward, when a slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair and familiar blue eyes approached the couple. "Matthew," she said, her voice trembling. "My beautiful boy." Lillian Blackridge had her son's eyes and smile, though weathered by years and sun. Her bohemian dress and turquoise jewelry couldn't have been more different from the conservative elegance Harold preferred, but there was an authenticity about her that was immediately appealing. Matthew's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, joy, hurt, love, before he simply opened his arms and embraced the mother he'd thought lost forever. "I'm so sorry," Lillian whispered, tears streaming down her face, "for leaving, for not finding a way to stay in your life." "You're here now," Matthew said, his own voice thick with emotion. That's what matters. Celine stood to the side, giving them space for this reunion, until Lillian turned to her with a warm smile. "And you must be Celine," she said, taking the younger woman's hands in hers. "Harold told me how you've changed our son's life, how you see him for who he really is." "I love him," Celine said simply, "just as he is." Lillian's smile widened. That's all any mother wants for her child. She glanced across the garden to where Harold stood, watching them with an unreadable expression. All any parent wants, though some show it in strange ways. The reception was held in the hospital's atrium, transformed with flowers and lights into a magical space. Elena presided over it all from her wheelchair, accepting congratulations and well wishes, her joy evident. Despite her failing strength. As the evening progressed, she grew visibly tired. Celine knelt beside her mother's chair, concerned. "Do you want to go back to your room? Rest a bit?" Elena shook her head. "No, darling. I want to see every minute of this day." She squeezed Celine's hand. "I'm so proud of you, of the woman you've become, of the life you're building." "Because of you," Celine said, tears threatening. "Everything I am is because of you, Mom." "Not everything," Elena corrected gently. "You have your father's courage, his ability to see the best in people. And you have your own strength, the strength that carried you through all those years of hardship without becoming bitter, the strength that lets you love without reservation, even when it's risky." She glanced across the room to where Matthew stood with his parents, an awkward trio still finding their way toward reconciliation. "That family needs you," Elena continued. "Your love, your perspective, your grounding force. And you need them too. Their support, their resources, yes, but more than that, their commitment to building something that will outlast all of us." There was a finality to her words that frightened Celine. "Mom, it's all right, my darling girl," Elena said, a serene smile on her face. "I've seen you married to a good man who adores you. I've seen the beginning of a legacy that will help thousands of people. My journey is complete." "Don't say that," Celine pleaded, clutching her mother's hand tighter. "The treatment has given me these precious extra months," Elena finished. "Time enough to see you settled. Time enough to make my peace." She touched Celine's cheek tenderly. "No more tears today. This is a celebration." Later that night, after the guests had gone and Elena had been settled back in her hospital room, Celine and Matthew stood on the balcony of the penthouse, looking out at the city lights. "Wife," Matthew said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "My wife." Celine leaned back against him, savoring the word and the commitment it represented. "Husband," she replied, her hands covering his where they rested on her waist. "Are you happy?" he asked, his lips brushing her temple. "Even with everything, my father, my mother, all the complications, I've never been happier," Celine assured him, turning in his arms to face him. "Your family is part of who you are, and I love who you are." Matthew's eyes darkened with emotion. "Even after today, I can hardly believe you're mine, that we found each other in that drawing room." "I was just there to clean the floor," Celine reminded him with a small smile. "Nothing more." "You were there to change my life," Matthew countered, pulling her closer, "to show me what real life matters." They kissed under the stars. The city spread out below them like a carpet of lights, a different world than the one where their story began, yet somehow exactly where they were meant to be. 3 weeks after the wedding, Elena Morgan slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Celine and Matthew by her side. Her final days had been calm, filled with quiet conversations and simple pleasures, sunlight on her face, music she loved, the presence of her daughter and new son-in-law. "No regrets," she'd told them the night before. "I've had a good life, loved and been loved. And now I get to see my Celine begin her own great adventure." The Foundation's first official act was establishing the Elena Morgan Memorial Fund, dedicated to supporting cancer patients and their families. Harold Blackridge, to everyone's surprise, was the first major donor, matching Matthew's initial contribution with one of his own. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he told Celine at the memorial service. "She reminded me of someone I once knew." Lillian, standing nearby, caught the reference and shared a look with her ex-husband. that spoke of old wounds slowly healing. 6 months later, the foundation headquarters opened in a renovated building near the hospital where Elena had received treatment. Celine, now serving as executive director, stood beside Matthew as they cut the ribbon, her heart full of pride and bittersweet joy. "She would have loved this," she whispered to her husband, thinking of her mother. "She does love it," Matthew corrected gently. "She sees it all." The foundation grew quickly, its mission resonating with donors and medical partners alike. Harold, semi-retired now, became an unexpected advocate, using his business connections to secure funding and support. And Lillian, dividing her time between her Arts Sea Olney and visits to New York, brought a creative energy to the foundation's outreach efforts. 1 year after their wedding, Celine found herself back at Blackridge Manor for the first time since she'd left with her mother and Harold's check. The grand house looked the same, imposing white columns, manicured grounds, an air of wealth and privilege. But this time, she didn't enter through the back door as a maid. She walked up the front steps on Matthew's arm, her head held high, her simple elegance drawing admiring glances from the staff who had once barely noticed her existence. Mrs. Winters, still ruling the household with an iron hand, greeted them with a stiff politeness that couldn't quite hide her discomfort at seeing the former maid return as the mistress. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackridge," she said, the title clearly difficult for her to pronounce. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Celine replied graciously. "It's good to be back." They were there for a purpose, to collect the last of Matthew's belongings before the manor was converted into the Blackridge Foundation's retreat center for recovering patients and their families. Harold would keep a suite of rooms, but the rest of the massive house would be repurposed to serve those in need. It had been his idea, surprisingly enough. "This place is too big for one old man," he'd said gruffly. "Might as well put it to good use." As Celine walked through the grand rooms, memories surrounded her, some painful, some precious. The drawing room where she'd first met Matthew, the library where he'd given her the violet, the garden where they'd shared their first kiss. She paused at the door to the garden house, running her fingers over the weathered wood. "Do you still have the key?" she asked Matthew, who stood watching her with understanding eyes. He smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out the small brass key on its chain. "I had it remade. I thought you might want it back someday." Celine took it, the weight familiar in her palm. So much had changed since the day she'd surrendered this key to Harold Blackridge, choosing her mother's life over her own happiness. Now, somehow, she had both, a life of purpose and love, and the precious memory of her mother at peace. She unlocked the garden house door, stepping inside a small stone building that had witnessed a pivotal moment in their story. The telephone still sat on the table by the window, though it was unlikely to be connected after all this time. "This is where it almost ended," she said softly. "Where your father nearly succeeded in keeping us apart." Matthew came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "But it didn't end, that's the important part." She leaned back against him, drawing strength from H's solid presence. "Sometimes I still can't believe it, that the maid and the heir actually got their happy ending." "Not an ending," Matthew corrected, turning her to face him. "A beginning, of a life together, of work that matters, of a family someday when we're ready." His hand drifted to her stomach, and Celine smiled, covering it with her own. "Someday soon," she said, the secret they'd been keeping for just a few weeks still new and wondrous between them. "Your father might be getting that grandchild sooner than he expects." Matthew's eyes widened, then filled with joy as he understood what she was telling him. "Celine," he breathed, pulling her closer. "Are you sure?" She nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby." He kissed her then, in the small garden house where they had nearly lost each other, sealing the promise of their future with tender earnest and passion. Later, as they walked back to the main house hand in hand, Celine paused to look up at Blackridge Manor, at its windows catching the late afternoon sun, at the history and legacy it represented. "Our child will never know what it was like," she said thoughtfully. "Me cleaning these floors, you as the untouchable heir. They'll grow up in a different world." "A better world," Matthew said, his voice certain. One where they'll understand Hatworth isn't about money or status or family names. It's about how you treat people, what you build, who you love. Celine looked at her husband, this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had loved her across every barrier of class and circumstance, who had chosen her even when it meant defying everything he'd been raised to believe. "Do you remember what you said to me, that first day in the drawing room?" she asked. Matthew smiled, the memo wry clear in his eyes. "Where have you been all my life?" "And now we know the answer," Celine said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "Right where I needed to be, waiting for you to see me, waiting for our story to begin." Hand in hand, they walked back into the house that had once divided them by status and expectation. The maid and the heir now partners in love and purpose, carrying with them the dust of the past and the promise of the future. Not an ending, but a beginning. A story still unfolding, built on choice and sacrifice and love that refused to be denied. A story that began with a girl cleaning floors, humming softly to herself, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The end.